The call that changed everything did not come from Marcus. It came from a stranger, and it was polite. And that is what made it so much worse. I was sitting at my usual corner table at Faye's Coffee on 5th, laptop open, latte going cold beside it, when my phone buzzed with a number I did not recognize. The voice introduced himself as Thomas Reeves, head of legal at Brightfield Ventures, and his tone carried the careful warmth of someone who had done this kind of call many times before. He said he was following up on payment terms that my representative had confirmed via email the previous week, and he wanted to make sure everything aligned before they moved the paperwork forward. I set my cup down slowly, told him I was not sure which email he was referring to, and asked him to forward me the chain. Thomas said, of course, right away, and the attachment landed in my inbox before I had even lowered the phone from my ear. I opened it, read from the bottom up the way my father taught me, because the beginning is where the truth lives, and the end is where people want you to look. The language was right. The tone was close, and the name signed at the bottom was mine in every way that mattered visually. But the email address in the sender field was off by a single character. One letter transposed in the domain. The kind of detail you miss entirely in a glance, and only catch when you are already looking for something wrong. I was looking because 3 days earlier, Marcus had asked me over dinner, in the most casual voice he owned, whether Brightfield had given us a final number yet. At the time, I answered without thinking, the way you answer someone you have never once thought to be careful around. Sitting in Faye's Coffee with Thomas still waiting on the line, that dinner question stopped feeling casual and started feeling like a measurement. I told Thomas I would call him back within the hour, kept my voice even, and the moment the call ended, I dialed Diana Price. My name is Serena Caldwell, and I want to be clear about something before this story goes any further. I did not build Lumen Trace by accident, and I did not survive what Marcus did to me by luck. I started the company at 29 with 2 college friends, a behavioral analysis framework I had been refining for 2 years, and the kind of stubbornness that does not announce itself but does not move either. I was the one who wrote the original pitch deck, rewrote it 4 more times before anyone outside our apartment ever saw it, and stayed up past midnight running user data models while my co-founders debated logo colors in the next room. My father, Owen Caldwell, spent 30 years as a sound engineer in Nashville, a man who worked in an industry built entirely on things you could not see: frequencies, timing, the half-second delay that ruins a live mix. And he taught me early that the invisible details are always the ones that matter most. When I showed him the 3rd version of my pitch deck, he did not comment on the design or the market projections. He just looked at me and asked whether I had saved every version, every draft, every email thread connected to it. And when I told him yes, he nodded once and said, "Good. Keep doing that." I thought he was being overly cautious the way older people sometimes are about paperwork. I understand now he was giving me the only defense that actually holds up. Every significant conversation I had about Lumen Trace lived somewhere in writing. Every term sheet discussion. Every investor update. Every internal decision about equity structure existed in a dated, organized folder that I had maintained since the company's first week. Marcus had spent 4 years watching me work from across the dinner table, and what he saw was a woman absorbed in her laptop, trusting and distracted. What he did not see was the system underneath, because I never showed it to him. Not out of suspicion, but because it was mine and I had learned to keep what was mine exactly that way. When Diana Price picked up my call that morning, I already had the email chain pulled up, the sender domain flagged, and 3 years of Brightfield correspondence open in a separate window for comparison. Diana did not ask me to slow down or start from the beginning. She listened for 90 seconds, then said quietly, "Send me everything you have right now." And I had already started the upload before she finished the sentence. Diana called me back within 2 hours of receiving my files, and the first thing she said was not reassuring and was not alarmed. It was precise. She told me that whoever had done this knew enough about the Brightfield deal to replicate the internal language, mirror the communication timeline, and create a receiving structure ready to accept a wire transfer before anyone noticed the substitution. And that level of operational detail did not come from the outside. It came from someone who had been in the room, or close enough to it that the difference did not matter. I already knew who that was. What I did not yet know was that Marcus had not built this alone. Diana retained a private investigator the same afternoon, a woman who worked financial fraud cases and did not ask unnecessary questions. The report came back inside a week, and it did not read like a surprise so much as a confirmation of something I had been circling without being able to name. Jade Farrow had registered the fraudulent email domain 2 months before Thomas Reeves ever called me, which meant the plan had been running longer than my marriage had been visibly failing. She had filed paperwork for an LLC in Delaware 3 weeks after that. With a registered agent address and a business account already open and waiting, she had met with Marcus at least 9 times across different locations during that window. Never the same place twice. The kind of pattern that does not happen by accident and does not belong to a casual relationship. What identified Jade specifically was not the domain registration or the LLC, though both were damning enough. It was a single writing habit buried inside the fake email chain that Diana's investigator flagged on the second read. The abbreviation used for Brightfield Ventures in the body of the emails did not match the way I write it, but it matched exactly the shorthand that event coordinators use on production briefs. A formatting convention specific enough to narrow the field considerably. I remembered then that Marcus had mentioned a coordinator named Jade after a corporate shoot he had worked months earlier. Mentioned her the way you mention someone unremarkable. Once and briefly, and never again. Diana laid the full picture out for me across her conference table and asked whether I was ready to move forward, her voice carrying none of the hesitation I might have expected given what we were about to set in motion. I told her I had been ready since the moment I read that email address and recognized the transposed letter for what it was. Not a typo, not an accident, but the one small mistake that unravels everything built on top of it. Diana filed the complaint with the FBI field office in Nashville the morning after our meeting, attaching the full email chain, the domain registration records, the Delaware LLC filing, and the investigator's report documenting every meeting between Marcus and Jade across those 9 locations. Wire fraud under federal statute does not require the transfer to have completed successfully, and that distinction mattered enormously here because it meant we did not have to wait for money to disappear before the law could move. The attempt itself, the fake domain, the intercepted communications, the fraudulent signatures on confirmation emails, was already enough to open a federal case. Agent Ray Decker arrived at Diana's office the following afternoon, wearing a plain blue shirt and carrying a legal pad. The kind of man who looks like he has heard every version of every story and stopped being surprised by any of them some time ago. He sat down, opened the folder Diana slid across the table, and worked through it page by page without speaking. When he reached the domain registration timestamp, he paused. Not dramatically, just the way someone pauses when a piece of information lands exactly where they expected it to. And then he looked up and asked me directly whether Brightfield Ventures would cooperate with the investigation. I told him Thomas Reeves had already called me after learning what had happened, and his exact words had been, "We will do whatever is necessary." Ray wrote something on his legal pad, capped his pen, and said, "Then we move from here." And that was the whole conversation. What I did not do was call Marcus. I did not text him. Did not alter anything in my routine. Did not give him any signal that the ground had shifted underneath the plan he thought was still running on schedule. He called me that evening to ask how my day had been, and I told him it was fine. Busy. The usual. And listened to him describe a shoot he had done across town, with the ease of someone who believes they are still several steps ahead. The FBI does not announce itself, and neither did I. Thomas Reeves formally suspended all deal communications connected to the fraudulent email thread and issued an internal hold on the transaction pending investigation, which meant that even if Marcus and Jade had tried to accelerate the timeline, there was nowhere left for the money to go. Marcus called me 2 evenings after Agent Decker's visit, and the careful casualness that had carried every conversation between us for months was gone, replaced by something tighter and more specific that he was trying very hard to control. He asked whether I had heard anything new from Brightfield, whether Thomas had been in touch, whether the deal timeline had shifted at all, and the questions came just slightly too close together to sound like idle curiosity. I told him nothing had changed that I was aware of, kept my voice exactly as even as it had been the night before, and listened to the half-second delay before he said that was good. That was fine. Just checking. He called Kyle Marsh that same night, and I know this because the investigator Diana had retained was still active, and because Kyle, when he was later subpoenaed, confirmed the timeline without being asked twice. Marcus told Kyle that something felt wrong, that he could not reach the email account he had been monitoring, that Jade was not responding the way she should have been. Kyle told him to calm down, that he was probably overthinking it, and drove over to meet him in person rather than say anything else on a recorded line, which was exactly the kind of decision that would cost Kyle considerably more than he expected. What Marcus did not know, and what Jade discovered only when she tried to log into the fraudulent domain from a different device, was that the FBI had flagged and frozen the email infrastructure at the server level, quietly and without notification, the way federal investigations move when they want to preserve evidence, rather than announce themselves. Jade's access attempt was logged, time-stamped, and added to the case file before she had finished realizing the login had failed. The Tennessee Licensing Board received a referral from the federal investigation within 48 hours, and Jade's event coordinator credentials were flagged for review, which meant her employer was notified before she had a chance to get ahead of the story herself. Kyle lost 3 corporate photography contracts inside a week after his name appeared on the witness list, 2 of the companies citing conflict of interest in their termination notices, and 1 simply going silent, which in its own way said everything. Every layer came down separately, slowly enough that each person felt the full weight of their own particular consequence before the next one arrived. Marcus and Jade were arrested at Nashville International while standing in the departure line for a flight to Miami, and the agents who approached them were not in uniform and did not raise their voices. Because federal arrests rarely look the way people expect them to when they have spent weeks believing they are still ahead of everything. Ray Decker had known about the flight booking since the day before, and he had let them pack their bags and drive to the airport and check their luggage before anyone made a move. Because the attempt to leave the state while under active federal investigation is its own separate piece of evidence, and he wanted it on the record. Marcus accepted a plea agreement several weeks into the process, offering full cooperation in exchange for a reduced charge, which meant he sat across from federal prosecutors and described in detail every conversation he had with Jade, every piece of internal information he had passed along, every decision point where he could have stopped and chose not to. His cooperation did not help Jade, whose attorney had advised her to fight the charges, and whose decision to go to trial meant that the domain registration records, the Delaware LLC paperwork, the investigator's GPS report, and Kyle's reluctant testimony were all entered into evidence and read aloud in a federal courtroom in Middle District of Tennessee. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Marcus received 31 months in federal prison. Jade received 43. Kyle was not imprisoned, but he was not untouched either. 3 years of federal probation and a conviction for obstruction that followed him into every background check he would face for the next decade, which in the photography industry meant that the corporate contracts he had built over years were effectively gone before his sentencing was finalized. Diana filed for divorce on the same week Marcus entered his plea, and because his criminal conduct was directly tied to marital assets and lumen trace equity, Tennessee's equitable distribution framework left him nothing credible to argue over. He had no position from which to negotiate and no leverage that had not already been entered into a federal case file. The divorce decree came through on a Tuesday afternoon while I was sitting in Diana's office reviewing the final documents, and she slid the signed order across the table without ceremony. The way someone hands you back something that was always yours to begin with. Thomas Reeves called me the week after the divorce was finalized to tell me that Brightfield wanted to resume the acquisition process, that the internal hold had been lifted, and that everyone on their side was prepared to move forward on the original terms, as though the interruption had belonged entirely to Marcus and Jade, which legally and factually it had. I thanked him, told him I would review the documents with Diana, and sat with the phone in my hand for a moment after the call ended. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I noticed I was not, and that absence of weight was its own kind of information. I called my father that evening, not to report anything or ask for anything, just because I wanted to hear his voice in the quiet that had settled into the apartment now that the noise of the past several months had finally stopped moving. I told him the deal was back on track, and that everything Diana had filed had gone through cleanly. And Owen Caldwell listened without interrupting, the way he always has, and then asked the same question he had asked me about every important thing I had ever done since I was 19 years old. Did you keep records of all of it? I told him yes. Every email. Every timestamp. Every version of every document from the first day to the last. He said, "Good." And I could hear him smiling through the phone without needing to see it. The morning I signed the Brightfield agreement, I was sitting at the same corner table at Faye's Coffee on 5th, where Thomas had first called me. Latte in hand. Laptop open. The ordinary architecture of my life, arranged exactly as it had always been. What was different was not visible to anyone around me. It lived in the fact that every account, every equity structure, every document connected to Lumen Trace had always carried only one name, and that name had never been anyone's to take. Thank you for staying with me through all of it, because this story carries more of my own life than I usually say out loud. If any part of what Serena held on to quietly, that steadiness, that decision to choose herself without making noise about it, felt familiar to you, then I hope it stays with you the way it has stayed with me.